evening, Warsaw. It's Monday, 7th of August. It will be sunny all day with highs of 19 degrees Celsius or 66 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:21 a.m. and sunset at 8:33 p.m. We are on the 7th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Roger will be telling us at some point more about these extraordinary barricades that were built in the city. But anyways, what else is happening during the uprising?
Thanks for that introduction, Philippe. Yes, Roger will be talking more about one of the most famous barricades during the Warsaw Uprising, but we're going to start with Claire today, and we haven't heard much about Zoe and what she's been getting up to during the uprising. Claire, can you fix that for us?
On day 7, Zoe is still coordinating the provision of supplies, so essentially that's grain and sugar, but also working now with medical supplies as well. But her base, the Grey Ursulines building in central Warsaw, is now under fire as well. And running supplies down the main street, New World Street or Nowy Swiat, is, she says, almost a death sentence at this point. So Nowy Swiat connects Three Crosses Square with the ancient royal palace. It's one of the main thoroughfares. And it's now the Germans have got their snipers moving along it. So one of her team members has actually been shot. So she's had her first casualty. And at that point, they realise that they need to move further south themselves. So they're not in the direct line of fire and can continue to provide these very important provisions. So they move down to a flat further south in Warsaw that's been abandoned. And they're actually delighted because in the cellar, they find some crates. I mean, everywhere they go, they are checking for any supplies in any property along the street, of course. But their cellar is full of wine and vodka. Zoe said she would have preferred to have found, potatoes or jars of pickled vegetables or something. But absolutely anything is welcome. So, so they're continuing their deliveries under fire.
So apart from Zoe, Claire, we've also got our RAF pilot, John Ward. What is happening with him? Where is he on this day?
So John Ward is this remarkable character who will resurface throughout the podcast because he was he was in fact a gunner on a ferry battle. He was downed in France in 1940. And he was taken prisoner of war, but he managed to escape. And he managed to reach, trying to get back, he managed to join the resistance in Poland. I mean, he plays this incredibly important role because he becomes basically the BBC war correspondent behind enemy lines. And he becomes the official Times correspondent for the Warsaw Uprising. So he is desperately keen to support the Poles telling the world what is happening. And this is important strategically as well, because the Soviets are putting out reports on what's going on, and they're giving a very different picture on who is fighting and what are the aims of the Warsaw Uprising. So to have the voice of the insurgents themselves broadcast to the world is really vital. And so John Ward on the 7th of August makes his first dispatch to the world. Later, he will broadcast through the Warsaw Uprising's own radio station, the Lightning station. But this is not yet set up. So his first dispatch is sent over through, it's transmitted by wireless. And this is what he says.
At 5 p.m. yesterday, German tanks of the Tiger type came through the streets of Warsaw with captured women tied on them to prevent the Polish troops from shooting. One tank was destroyed using bottles of petrol owing to a lack of anti-tank guns. Warsaw has excellent chances and a large part of the city is in Polish hands. Please send us weapons and ammunition as soon as possible.
So as we heard from Zoe, people are now getting forced back from their initial positions that they were holding, and they have to evacuate. And that means taking some civilians as well as moving the resistance forces around the city. Alina, how are they doing this? We've got the first use of the sewer evacuations, don't we?
We do, Claire. The first evacuation actually takes place in the district of Ochota, where we have Kominski's brigade operating. The insurgent group who's defending the area there are completely surrounded by the enemy, completely outnumbered, and then they decide to withdraw to another part of town. So the problem here is their only possibility to evacuate is through the sewer. But getting to the sewer is another problem. They're constantly under enemy fire. So they decide to dig a passage from the cellars on one of the streets to one of the sides of the manholes. The work takes a couple of days. It's today that they start doing that work. It takes a couple of days. It's completed on the 10th of August about the evening. And then about on the 11th, after a couple of unsuccessful attempts of trying to find a way in, the group of about 83 insurgents managed to get through about a kilometre The problem here is that the sewers are exceptionally low in this part of the system. They measure about 110 by 60 centimetres, and that's not very high considering I'm 170. We're looking about half of my height. So me being 5'6", so about half of that. And they finally managed to exit the manhole on the other side. So this is the first time insurgents, an armed detachment of the Warsaw Uprising, had managed to pass and evacuate themselves through the sewers. This had taken them 6 hours to get through a kilometre of sewers through the dark and murky waters. So apart from escaping through the sewers, or at least this being the first evacuation that takes part using the sewer system, we're going to come to this point where we've kind of alluded what Roger's going to be talking about, and that is this barricade. And by the end of the war, we've got over 1,000 barricades that have been documented, and there are probably more, and those ones had been destroyed. We're not quite sure how many there actually were. There possibly could have been many, many more. But there's one very important barricade, and I want to let Roger tell you all about it.
Yeah, probably one of the most significant was the barricade that was put up across Jerusalem Avenue in the centre of Warsaw. This is one of the sort of main east-west axes across the city, so it's very important for the Germans to try and secure it, and that obviously that then was a reason for the Poles to try to deny them that. The problem with Jerusalem Avenue is that it's a very wide road, as avenue would suggest. It's sort of 25, 30 metres wide. So it's very difficult to actually try and secure properly. But this construction around that began around August 7th, with sappers both digging into the road as well, so creating a ditch, but also digging up the paving slabs and using sandbags and anything else that available that was that they could use to form a blockade. So trolley buses, trams, anything at all, to create a really, really fundamental barrier on Jerusalem Avenue.
They even used these massive, like cotton reels, didn't they, that had been used from the cable factory for cables that would have gone underground. They had them, they looked like 4-foot-high cotton reels, and there were loads of them. You see them in the photographs. It's one of the most documented, the uprising is one of the most documented battles. So it looks absolutely extraordinary, like modern art, some of these barricades.
Yeah, and of course, there's huge amounts of rubble. I mean, all over the city at this point already. So, it's quite relatively straightforward to sort of pile that up on top of whatever other material that you had. But as you say, we don't know how many barricades were actually erected during the Warsaw Rising, but as you said, 1,000 were documented, and that gives you an idea of how it was. It wasn't as though the insurgents sort of held a discrete area of the city. They held many pockets of the city, and that meant that you had these barricades to sort of so that they could have some form of defence against German attack. So that proliferation of the barricades is sort of proof of that very sort of splintered nature of the area that they held at the time. But it's one of those sort of, I suppose, sort of seminal images of the Warsaw Rising is of the insurgents fighting on barricades.
The other interesting thing that happens today is that the commanders of the Warsaw Uprising released a new hygiene regulation because disease is spreading rapidly throughout the city. Considering this is a week after the start of the uprising, it's quite important to be able to adhere to some of these rules. And the spread of dysentery is absolutely rife. So what do they say in this new order? Well, they ask the population to stop the following things. So, for example, not drinking unboiled water. So everybody has to boil their water. They also have to wash their hands before eating, and we think that's a given right now. But you've got to remember, people here are fighting. They're not thinking that the hygiene is the most important thing. They're trying to save their lives. They're also encouraged to destroy their waste by burning or burying because it's a breeding ground for flies at this stage. Also, keeping your toilets clean is quite important. And if possible, carrying out disinfection of the toilets with milk, lime or other disinfectants. Food products need to be secure, and they've also got to destroy any flies they come into contact. Flies also spread disease, and to report any intestinal disorders. So, for example, the spread of dysentery. They recommend that patients with diarrhea stay in bed and should call a district doctor. Of course, this is not a very easy thing. You're in the middle of a battle, you're in the middle of fighting, and you're constantly being bombed. So it's not a very easy situation. There's a really good testimony from Tadeusz Burkomrowski, who we've heard from before.
Dysentery was beginning to spread. I fell victim to it at this point. It was quite impossible to diet, of course, but the messengers were untiring in their effort to help me and to find a little suitable food. As there was no time of being ill, I was alright again after a week.
So the city, just to give an idea of it, I mean, it's humming. It's humming with blue bottles in the ruins where people are unable to retrieve some of the bodies of the dead. They do, of course, retrieve the corpses on the streets, and early on there is quite a respectful system. So there are mass graves being dug and people are laid in communal graves. But they are covered with paper, with newspapers initially, and whatever they have. So there is respectful attention paid to the dead. And yet there is this obviously very severe risk of disease spreading through the city.
The situation on the ground is absolutely horrible. The hygienic conditions are just spreading so much disease. But the conditions in Pruszków, which is what we talked about yesterday, the conditions there are not any better, are they, Roger?
Yeah, the Germans sort of set up various collection points around the city, the area that the city that they held, where they would collect up civilians for deportation. And the first group of those civilians was sent from Wola, so they had survivors effectively of what had been going on, the brutality and massacres in Wola. But the first group of civilians were marched down from Wola down to Pruszków, which is a distance of about 18 kilometers or so. There's about 3,000 of them are marched down to Pruszków on this day, and they were the first of many tens of thousands that were deported via Pruszków during and after the rising.
What's very odd is that even though they're deporting civilians at this point, they're still continuing to rape and murder across the city. So the atrocities don't stop, and Kamiński's brigade is still running rampant through Ochota at this point. Thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. Please tune in tomorrow for day 8.